how did you first get involved with pharma?
Well, by accident, really. I think as I suspect most people, which is I left university with, I'm going to say, a bad genetics degree, which was one that didn't allow me to go on and do the PhD that I wanted to do in biotechnology. But I had discovered two things at university, which was I'm not a very good student, which was obvious. I was very interested in some things and very uninterested in other things that were in a genetics course. But I also started writing fiction. I was a good writer, and I decided that a career in science publishing would be the way to go. So I ended up working at Elsevier as my first career step, which was science publishing. And actually that took me to a company called ADIS International, where I was part of drugs, the journal, and then went into what they call sort of specialist publications, which actually put me straight in contact in a very young age with pharmaceutical strategy, the way that they would use a medical publishing company. So I actually, by about the age of 23, was already into sort of pharmaceutical publishing, and it was such a rich vein of things to be interested in. So I was a bad student, but I found that sort of the breadth, the depth, the way that pharmaceutical companies think about even things like publication strategy, pre-launch strategy. So from then I was into the pharmaceutical strategy space, and really have people often tell their stories in reverse, right? So if now I'm well past 23, I found that this has mostly been a case of really picking the things that I've liked and pivoted towards over that time, and that kind of very early pre-launch stage when decisions are being made, I found to be the most interesting part of what I do.
I agree. It's a really, really fascinating industry to work in, and you learn so many different things. I guess over your career, what have been the most eye-opening moments, and maybe some of the biggest frustrations with the industry?
Eye-opening moments, I think, are, they're often down to fortune. It's when you've been lucky enough to be around a brand team that's outperformed, that's just done something different. So I was lucky enough to be involved in the launch of Avastin, and other, some of the biggest drugs that we've ever launched. Opdivo, the best launch in the immuno-oncology space. Ocrevus, best launch ever at Roche. I was lucky enough to be around those, and the kind of eye-opening moments for me were, how often great brand teams succeeded either because of or despite the organization that surrounded them. And I think because of that, I started being interested in, I always remember talking to some folks because I wanted to build some case studies. So case studies like, how did Lipitor launch? And it was interesting speaking to folks who were around the Pfizer building at that point, and not many people knew exactly what had contributed to Lipitor's success and failure. So I found that to be remarkable, because A, you've launched the biggest drug ever, and it's in your organization, and there's this assumption that the organization knows it. And actually the reality is they don't. The lessons from how that happened. And the most eye-opening thing for Lipitor, for example, was the discovery of serendipity. How much luck was involved in launching the world's best ever drug. So there's some good choices made, there's some good strategy there, but the amount of luck that was involved, this was a drug that was forecast to do $1 billion a year 6 months before launch, and it ended up doing $14-15 billion a year, very soon after that. So, no one seems to mind if you get the forecast wrong that way, but it was true, right? But some of the things that they did because they thought it was going to be a small launch were really intriguing. They changed the regulatory endpoints. They changed the positioning. So, for me, my sweet spot is this sort of positioning space. And I thought that was the world's best positioning that I'd ever seen at that point. How they changed what the market thought it wanted and changed what everyone did want almost overnight. but mostly because they had to. I mean, they had no choice other than to launch a small drug. And the interesting thing was Lipitor itself was bigger than Pfizer was before they bought Lipitor. I mean, that's some of that stuff you talk about eye-opening. I think this is how dramatic the industry can change quickly. And the most frustrating things are all the same, which is that pharma has those lessons sitting around to be learned and doesn't learn them. It mostly is. I'm going to say my biggest frustration in 30 years of doing this is the management consultancy type stuff that people do without even thinking about it. And then you've got a bunch of management consultants who don't think about it either, who just want to do more work, do more research. They don't care. Is that how much of that goes around is just this massive trough that everyone sort of dives into and gets their piece of and doesn't really care. And that's my frustration, is that I always contrast. People look so hard to find like one way to do everything. All drugs get treated one way. And actually the reality is that treating drugs as individuals, almost like as individual children, is the best way to treat them. But the industry continues to behave as if you want to standardize the way that you do everything. And that frustrates me today as much as it did 30 years ago.
Yeah. Now, obviously today you have your own consultancy. Tell me the full story behind that, including, what inspired you to set the company up.
Well, if I give you the honest version.
Go for the honest version.
So the honest version was, so if you go 21 years ago, I was working in a medical communications company. We were doing very well. We were growing really fast, and then we were acquired by the largest CRO in space at that time, and they wanted to change things to kind of homogenize what we did, and I didn't agree with any of it. Didn't agree with what they wanted to do. And strategically, it wasn't just a thing. So I had a conversation with the CEO at the CRO and said, look, I don't agree with any of this. Laid out the reasons why, and then but because they essentially set their plans in motion, they weren't planning on changing their mind. So I resigned there and then, without a plan of what to do. I remember calling my wife up. It was like 10 p.m. in North Carolina, and my wife picked the phone up at 3 a.m. and I told her I'd resigned, and she said, "Okay, we'll be okay." I got on a plane that night and landed back at Heathrow. I mean, the good thing was, the job offers were coming in all over the place, but the company I was with enforced 6-month garden leave, which was really the best thing that could have happened, because I got to sit at home. My kids were young, very young, and the change in lifestyle was huge. They've gone from essentially being on a plane every Monday to somewhere to seeing the kids grow up. And I decided that I would consult rather than take another paid gig in order to enjoy a better lifestyle, a better balance of work and life. And we actually, my wife and I discussed this. If I ended up earning half as much as I had, but I had this quality of life, that would be much better. As it turned out, during that garden leave, people started feeding me consultancy anyway. They didn't like the fact that I was, not visible anymore, and I enjoyed that process. So we set up IDEA Pharma 20 years ago, essentially as a lifestyle consulting gig. We did a bunch of stuff. We did early digital. We did medical communications. We did some, essentially, as the name implies, the idea of IDEA was to be at the creative end of strategic consulting, which meant that we took on things like digital. We took on things like DTC strategy and a bunch of other things. And the process from there to here has mostly been about giving away some of the stuff where lots of people do it, and starting to focus on the stuff that we do. But in reality, I'm going to say we spent way longer as a lifestyle business. When I say lifestyle business, a kind of a good consulting business that didn't have growth ambitions. We just grew without thinking about it, because we were quite good at it, to now thinking about it a lot harder, and having a deliberate growth strategy and a deliberate, disruption approach, to what we do. So that meant bringing in people that are much better at running a business than I am. You know, I get to stay focused on, you know, the areas that I'm good at, and we've got a really good team now. Whereas you know, 20 years ago it was much more a case of, you know, a happy band of pirates that were, you know, out there, you know, doing well, feeding themselves, but not really making a dent in the industry, apart from the brands that we got to work on.
Okay. And then, you know, you've worked on a lot of launches, worked with a lot of new companies. What are the top mistakes that you see over and over again when companies are bringing new products to market?
Well, I'd go back to what I said before, which is that I think this belief in, you know, it was pervasive 20 years ago, 10 years ago, still today, of like marketing excellence type approaches, which is to standardize stuff. Which means that people think you need an ad agency to do X and you need a market research agency to do Y. And the reality is that most people only have a glimpse of the jigsaw, right? That they bring their jigsaw pieces to the table and they think that's the only way to do it. So I think people over market research. I think they, you know, I use the metaphor, it's, you know, they often look for insight under the one lamppost on a dark street. You know, that's the only place they look for insight. So if you are doing all of your research and all of your testing and everything under that one light, you never look beyond that to see what's possible. So the thing that I think people get wrong is that they look in the rearview mirror at the way the market has been and don't look at the way that it could be. And that is the biggest mistake that companies make when they're launching, is thinking about the world that could be, not the world that has been. And of course, you know, you think about the kind of basic mistakes of market research, which is to, I mean, first of all, you've got a sampling bias. You can only ask the people that are prepared to be asked, you know, for their answers, which might not be a representative group. You can't ask very many of them anyway, because you don't have the budget to do it. And then, you know, doctors think like doctors, you know, or certainly they answer questions like doctors do. They don't necessarily tell you what they feel. In many cases, we've gone against what people think that they think and looked into the psychology of the way they make decisions and so forth. And so I think there's so many things that we've done that would run counter to the kind of traditional approaches. But you see, most people make those mistakes. They do what they think they have to. They deeply research a therapeutic area, a landscape, the way that it was. They look at competitors in a certain way. They think it's all data led instead of emotional, or the job that the physician has to get done. So I think that you know, if there was if we presented a polar opposite to anything, it would be that trying to project forward to a landscape that doesn't exist today, which, you know, was the reason I was interested in Lipitor, right? Because, you know, Lipitor didn't have any reason to succeed. It was a fifth to market. You know, people were calling it a Me Too. It succeeded because it didn't follow the game that the others had led. It played a different game, and I think that lesson has always worked. I think the one that doesn't work is the one where you believe that, you know, the game is going to be a data-led thing. And then we looked at, you know, we've got some very basic cheats, like, you know, I was always frustrated. And like I say, because I'm a bad student, I live in that sort of middle layer between sort of the lay person and the scientist. So when somebody says to me, oh, this is going to be an efficacy play, I always ask a stupid question, say, well, what do you mean by efficacy? What do you mean by working? So, you know, you take, say, a rheumatoid arthritis drug, and, you know, working could be it reduces pain. Working could be that it reduces damage or progression or, you know, or inflammation. It could be any of those things that you mean by working. So efficacy is one of those nonsense words that people use, thinking everyone knows what they mean. And of course they don't. But that's where the real sweet spots for someone that's prepared to, you know, to learn their instrument, if you like, can play with. You know, I spend a lot of my time listening to and loving music, and I've got a record label which I run as a sort of as a hobby, because it's never paid me any money back. You know, one of the intriguing things there about the musicians I really love are the ones who, you know all the ways of playing their instrument, and then when they do decide to play something, it's on purpose. And I think the same thing would be true of pharmaceutical strategies. You've got to know all of the different ways that you could do it in order to choose the one that you're going to go with this time. And it could be, you know, like Picasso or whoever, that, you know, you were just a normally great artist and then you decided to focus on being something specific. I think that route is available to most drugs as well if they were only to embrace it. So yeah, so sort of long rambling answer, but I think that, you know, I think the opportunity is to project instead of to, you know, instead of to do retrospective analysis of the way markets were.
Do companies sort of realize the limitations of the current way they do things? Obviously, they've always done it the same. How do they react when you point it out?
So it's much easier to do it the way they always have. I mean, you know, if the 30 people that are, you know, working on drugs in your pipeline all bring you the same slide deck, it's much easier for you to do a compare and contrast on what they're showing you. And I think that's a big risk. I think to have the agility to allow something to behave differently, you've got to trust the teams. You know, you've got to actually give them room to do something that's meaningful and believe in them when they say that it's the best way to do it. You know, because either you decide that the people at the top of the oracles and you've got to bring them stuff and they'll tell you whether it's right or not, or you believe that the teams should be trusted to do this themselves. So, and I think that's the hard thing, to let go and say, look, you know, I think if you're going to launch here or there, these, you know, that should be encouraged. So, so I think the companies that are, you know, where the progression is slow and steady and you get to become senior and then you know, every 6 months you review a brand plan. Well, you already know something about those companies, which is, you know, what are they looking at? Why are you even reviewing it? You know, what are you going to add if you're only looking at it every 6 months? If they've got to teach you something about the therapeutic area in order for you to say whether it's good or not. And those companies that have done well, you look at Gilead and the antivirals, or, you know, some companies that are doing something for the first time. The leadership already understood antivirals, so it was easy for them to say yes or no to the brand plan. So I think it depends on the organization, you know, how comfortable the leadership are with challenge, with being brought into a conversation rather than being presented at. And those, you know, I mean, very famously, is one of the, you know, one of the top 10 pharma companies at the moment. And people talk about the CEO there as the world's highest paid brand manager, because, you know, he, you know, wants to look at every slide deck, every detail aid, and wants to, you know, have input to it, which is fine if you really know what you're doing. But actually, that company's launched nothing, you know, meaningful in the last 5 years. So, and it's one of the things when we built the index, the Pharmaceutical Innovation Index, that we set out to say, you know, do people make a difference to drugs, or do drugs make all the difference in their own right?
And on that topic, do you want to tell us a little bit more about the index that you do?
Yeah, yeah, it was one of those happy accidents again of, you know, so we sat around an office 11 years ago, and we were just, you know, shooting the breeze about various stuff. And I asked that question of, you know, the industry behaves as if assets, you know, the molecules make all the difference, right? They're all, you know, the job is done once you get a good one into your pipeline. And say, well, is it true that if, and let's say you gave the same drug to 2 different companies in phase 1, would they be equally successful? And, you know, everyone knew the answer was no. You know, the drugs themselves would not be the main determinant of the future success on market. You know, they might not reach market. Even if they do reach market, would they be the same? And there's so many case studies, you know, Advair versus Symbicort, and, you know, Lipitor versus the class. And but I thought, well, what an intriguing question to pose and understand whether there could be an answer. So if everyone knows the answer is no, but no one knows why, then you have to dig into, well, what are the reasons that companies tend to be more or less successful when they launch medicines? And of course, the reason that we wanted to know this was, you know, although we're relatively confident that we're good at what we do, what if there's a better way? You know, that was the question that appealed to us. And if I use a sort of, you know, football, soccer metaphor, you know, look at the English Premier League. I mean, the teams in the top 10, they don't all play the same style of football. You know, there is some of them, you know, they more attacking, more defensive. Some buy players at 16, some buy players at 25. You know, they have very different ways of getting to where they are. And the same thing turned out to be true of the pharmaceutical industry as well, which is, you know, playing the same style of football isn't necessarily going to guarantee you that you're going to be the top of the Premier League next year. And we did this for the first time. We looked at about 80 different things that we knew was a surrogate for giving the same drug to the same company at the same time in phase 1. Took a look back at the last 5 years, so this was objective. We took the top 30 companies by market cap, and we said, right, this is our set. All the data is public. We see how good they are at not losing drugs in phase 3. We see how good they are at getting market access. We see how good they are at selling in their first year, second year, and so forth. And then we can compare and contrast them with people that were doing the same thing at the same time. So, talk about Keytruda or Opdivo. I mean, there's another head-to-head race. Both companies had those same drugs at the same time. Drugs are essentially interchangeable. So, lots and lots of case studies that we were able to look at. So this became a meaningful thing. We published it for ourselves the first year. And actually the company that came top that year was J&J. The first letter that we got, and it was still letters rather than emails, even 10 years ago, was from Paul Stoffels at J&J. And his question to us was, A, thank you for recognizing our innovation, but B, how do we improve? And it was a really intriguing question, was, you come top and you still want to get better. And I thought that was an interesting glimpse into the mindset. So it became a thing, and we published it annually, and it became something now that people put straight onto their website if they come first, because it's a significant measure of not just talking about innovation, but actually delivering it. And then we added in it, because we were very specific, innovation is about the creation of value from your pipeline. And a lot of people still think innovation is about good ideas. We said, no, innovation is about adding value. It's like, same drug, 2 different companies getting to market. Invention is the creation of novel ideas. So that essentially the building of a pipeline. So we added an invention index 2 years ago to reflect those people who've got great pipelines. They're full of breakthroughs, and they're full of, intriguing designations by regulatory groups, or their first-in-class molecules, or their, whatever. But then you've got this interesting axis, right? You've got the people that are great at pipelines, the people that are great at launching, and you can see, how they play along there. But it all comes back to, we wanted to understand if someone's doing it better, we would want to know about it. If someone's coming through and they've got a different way of playing, we would want to spot it before somebody else did.
Do you see any common qualities in the companies that repeatedly do well in the index? Have you been able to identify some broad points?
Yeah. So we see trends. I think, because we've got this 5-year rolling view constantly, companies have come and gone. I think the ones that have got, I'm going to say there's this kind of Hollywood model, right? Which is, if you launch enough drugs, some of them will be successful. They may be the ones that you thought would be successful. They may not, but actually, richness. So bigger companies tend to do better than smaller companies, just because they've got more coming through. They've got less invested in every one drug as a percentage of what they're good at. But I think, to your question, the most important trend is, that seems obvious as soon as you say it, is the companies that understand their therapy area really well tend to do better than the ones that don't. But there's a caveat. I think we've seen in oncology, for example, a lot of companies who used to be good at oncology, essentially understanding the previous wave, but not necessarily understanding the next wave. So you see people that were good at oncology 20 years ago who missed the immuno-oncology wave 10 years ago. And then they swim like mad to try and catch up. So that's a trend. And I think those, say I mentioned Gilead before. I mean, Gilead in antivirals, huge. Gilead in oncology, horrible. And so that kind of contrast is interesting. You go, well, so you've got a leadership that understands antivirals, who are now bringing an oncology portfolio to make decisions. So our big takeaway was actually the competency of leaders to make decisions is a fundamental part of this, how they take decisions, who they allow to make decisions for them. And there was an interesting comment in the conversation I had with Dan Skavronsky, the head of R&D at Lilly recently, when he talked about the way that they've essentially built a kind of cluster of biotechs. He said, if you're going to buy Loxo Oncology, a biotech, because they're a great oncology company, why would you then want to make them ask you whether something is a good idea or not? He said, you give them everything. And I thought that was such a wonderfully humble approach to this, which is, you know, our industry is full of uncertainty, and you've only got two responses to that. One is you can either pretend it doesn't exist and try and predict your way out of it, which is what most people do, or you lean into the uncertainty, say, well, actually, we need to become a learning organization. And some of these decisions need to be taken faster. They need to be taken closer to the kind of cold face. And companies that have done that have tended to do better. And then you run into the kind of different philosophies. I mean, some people think, you know, launching one main asset and then just life cycling it, you know, you keep adding, you know, another 10 indications. Well, once that first launch is past 5 years, we don't even count it. You know, so if you're investing heavily in a drug that you launched 5 years ago, we don't really count that anymore. So those companies don't do well on the innovation index just because of that. But I think it's a perfectly valid strategy. It's just that we don't count it. So, but so all of this was meant to feed us, and it's become something that the industry's kind of, you know, taken as a kind of marker of success for their ability to add value. But for me, it really talks to, I mean, innovation means your regulatory people and your clinical people and your medical affairs people and your marketers, they're all having an impact. I think the idea that it's just scientists and it's all about the molecule, I think that's such a failed policy. That I think the good news is this is organizational. I think when, you know, medicine makers are people that are able to, you know, understand manufacturing faster than other people do, or, you know, or you get to cell and gene therapies, even how to commercialize some of that stuff or manufacture it or quality control it. But I think that's a really, you know, energizing idea, is that the organizations make a difference rather than just the molecules that you put in at the front end.
And then, you know, last year, I know that you wrote a book on pharmaceutical positioning. Tell us a bit about that. Yeah,
well, it was, and I need to be clear here, because I got that one Amazon review that told me that it wasn't deep enough or heavy enough with case studies. So, you know, take the 1-star reviews to heart. But it never set out to be a kind of templated guide to do pharmaceutical positioning. It was intended to distill the lessons I've had from doing this for 30 years now. And, you know, I mean, my company's worked on 8 of the 15 biggest launches of the last 5 years. You know, we positioned 8 of the 15 biggest, which, you know, way exceeds our scale as an organization. It was an attempt to reclaim positioning from the ad agencies that do it badly, from the market research agencies that do it horribly, and say, look, positioning is a strategic activity. Positioning should be thought about at phase 1. And phase 2 and phase 3, and that positioning at those stages isn't the same. You know, that at phase 1 you're making choices of where to launch the drug, you know, what indication, you know, what patient segment. Those are strategic choices. Phase 3, you're essentially telling a story, you know, and beyond that, repositioning and so forth. So it was an attempt to have people think harder about positioning than they seem to. It's mostly visual. It's mostly kind of a series of small lessons instead of a big textbook, because, you know, I think the other people don't really read a lot of stuff in our industry. You know, they don't read many textbooks on things, especially the commercial folks. So it was meant to be just a kind of simple distillation of some of the lessons that I've learned over time about, you know, it's even things like one drug, two companies. I mean, that itself says you can't just do basic research. You have to do projected kind of understanding of, if your drug was one of these, how would people feel versus something else? Even to the, you know, even the fact that positioning of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and on market positioning are not the same task. You know, because a lot of people, the marketing excellence folks, have an approach to positioning. You go, well, you can't, you know, you can't have an approach to positioning. You know, being first in class, being best in class, you know, all those things we wanted to sort of address as interesting lessons. So, so version 1 of the book is out. I'm still dwelling on the 1-star review and feeling like I should maybe put a few case studies in and a few more how-to templates into the back.
Yeah, it's got to be interesting for people to have the information in that much detail, because I think, you know, like people say, they focus on the molecule. If the molecule works, they almost think their job is done.
Yeah.
And that's obviously not true.
Well, yeah, and that's one of our biggest wishes for our industry, is that we would do more than just jump the lowest hurdle possible, which is typically approval. And you know, one of the kind of the main reasons that IDEA does what it does, and I know we created the additional company Protodyne, was I'm going to say regulatory approval is relatively easy, but it is not necessarily the most useful thing that you could do for your molecule. So, you know, and because I've gone backwards from like positioning and market access into early phase strategy, you say, well, if we're just setting up problems for later, that doesn't really help anyone. If we're making it harder for us to gain market access and reimbursement, or for anyone to want to write a script because they literally don't know the difference between my molecule and somebody else's, well, that was something I could have fixed earlier. So I think it's an interesting insight into the opportunity seeking versus risk mitigating kind of approach, which is, yeah, there was a conversation I had with someone at a top 5. And this was a discovery scientist, and he was talking about his kind of TRPV1 receptor antagonist, and interesting pain drug, and which targets heat pain receptors. And I said, so where is it at the moment? He said, oh, it's in a proof of concept study. And okay, which proof of concept study? He said, oh, it's an osteoarthritis proof of concept. Okay, just help me, again, not being a very good student. I said, are there any of those receptors in the joints? He said, no. I said, so why is it in an osteoarthritis proof of concept? He said, well, apparently, when we asked our regulatory people how you would get this approved, they said you have to do an OA proof of concept. And I said, well, did you ask specifically about this drug, or was it, in general, how do people get a pain, a path to market? But he said, oh, I think it was the latter. It was, how do people usually get a pain drug to market? They do an OA proof of concept. The ones that are left and go on to do more interesting stuff. So I said, will the drug work? He said, no. I said, so the drug will die just because it's been put into the wrong field, if you like, of, it's a good seed in the wrong field. And he said, yeah, that's exactly what will happen. I said, and it was entirely predictable. And so, well, and for us, this was about, well, actually, if you needed to carve out a path for that molecule that would A, get it approved, but B, go into a useful patient population, you had to think, well, what kind of pain is this for? What kind of patients is this for? How would this drug get to market? Not how do drugs usually get to market? And that was such a, and sometimes you get those pivot points and you go, well, actually, that is a more interesting thing for us to explore than the average question, which is how do people usually get to market? The more interesting question is, how do you get this asset to market? And does it have an opportunity if you get it there? So that really changed the way that we approach, life in general.
I think, throughout this conversation, you've given so many little tips and tricks for people, and hopefully you've encouraged a lot of people to think very differently about positioning. Maybe just in summary, can you just summarize maybe your top 3 essential things for positioning? Because there's probably some companies out there that don't have a clue, or are suddenly thinking they need to change things quite quickly.
Yeah, so, well, I think the most overwhelming one is that your product is not the same as the molecule. I mean, the product for us is a result of 1,000 choices that you'll make on the way to market. And that can be as fundamental as choosing the dose, choosing a dose that delivers the kind of efficacy that you want. You talk about unpacking efficacy, that's another one. That's one of our key cheats. Let's decide what working looks like for your drug, and let's decide, who that's going to be valuable for. So I was thinking about opportunity-seeking behavior, and I think that phase 1, phase 2 positioning is the most important thing you can do for a drug, which is to be thinking actively about where you want to, where you want your drug to end up, and what problem it's going to solve, and then you build your execution that way. Clearly, in phase 1, you don't know enough to make a decision, so therefore you have to set up to find out. And that is, I think that's so key to how a kind of opportunistic mindset works, a kind of growth mindset, which is, because if you've pre-decided that your drug's going to be an X and then it fails all the studies on the way to being an X, well, that's just bad news in most cases, and the industry calls it attrition. If you've decided that you're interested in it being an X or Y or a Z, or maybe even an A or a B, and then you find that it isn't a very good expert, actually does seem to have, you know, intriguing clues about being a Z or a B, then, you know, that is an intriguing thing to be finding out. You've got to prospectively do that. You can't just hope that that'll come from your, you know, minimal phase 1, phase 2s. So I think that, you know, the biggest lesson is positioning in phase 1 is huge. I think trying to decide where a good place to land would be, trying to prospectively design things like endpoints, you know, ways of measuring into studies, you know, and along the way you find out things like, you know, I hadn't realized even things like disease modification in ophthalmology, right? It typically relies on how many lines on an eye chart you can see. So of course, if you've got this sort of steady decline in your vision, but the only way you can measure it is by going from like the 4th line down to the 3rd line down to the big letter at the top. Well, actually, that is a kind of, that's incremental. That's not, you know, that's not steady. So we're killing some good drugs just because we can't measure them in any interesting ways. So I think the ability to project, I think, then brings in technology and other things. So that would be the first one, is to see, you know, drugs as potentially differentiated, rather than just to see them as the molecule has already self-determined its own fate. So, you know, I can't overemphasize that core message. And then the other thing I think is that there's no one, no one can be right about this. You know, we've built our culture internally on everyone here being challenged on any opinion that they have, because it's impossible for a clinician to be right about the market opportunity. It's impossible for a regulator to be right about, you know, how a clinical trial size or a commercial opportunity, you know, and so therefore you need a team. And so that, you know, we always used to say there's no I in IDEA. It's kind of like no one's allowed to consult alone, because you have to be bouncing off other people. And not just bouncing off people to be right, but bouncing off people to be interesting. And I think that's the most, the what if moment, when someone said, what if we were to launch an X or a Y? And that's led to us challenging things like, you know, we positioned Avastin for launch and people said, oh, you can't, you know, ad agencies have these rules that you can't position on mechanism. Well, we did. You know, people say, you know, you can't change the rules on like the regulatory landscape. And you go, well, with Ocrevus, we did. You know, we changed the regulatory landscape there. There's a load of things that you can do if you ask the question first, and that for us was one of the big things. And the third thing, probably for us as an organization, is find the best clients. And we've had a rule, which is we never want to work with a client that doesn't have ambition. So we literally will turn work down if someone just wants to do the same as everyone else. Our people here want to come into work on a Monday morning to work on stuff where the client matches their ambition. You know, we'll stay up late on a Friday night working on strategy if the client is as excited about it as we are. So we never work on generics. We only work on stuff that's interesting, especially if it's novel, but really we want someone that wants to outperform the marketplace. So our statistics have been great, but I think it's because we found great clients who want to achieve. So we just happen to have been around and enabled their journey. So I think pharma companies can learn from that. I think those people are easy to spot. You know, the people that want to do great work in those organizations, or the people who just want to come in and, you know, punch the time clock. You know, they're not the same. So I think if we've been successful, it's been because the clients that we've found or we've had some chemistry with have been, you know, achievers rather than just time servers.